Hello there, everyone, and welcome once again to our wonderful pod where pop culture meets PR. Before we get stuck into this episode, listeners, the eagle-eyed amongst you, if you are watching wherever you get your podcasts, will notice that our very own Jackie Vors is elsewhere. She's not in her recording studio, as it were. Jackie, just very quickly, just regale our listeners with where you are. Whereabouts are you coming from today?
Actually in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and it's beautiful. The weather's fantastic out here for a bit of R&R. And don't want to make anybody jealous, but it's brilliant.
Well, yeah, I just thought we would address the difference in optics. We talk a lot about visuals and visual PR here on the podcast.
Nice segue.
There you go. And obviously the visuals are a little bit different for yourself today. And I for one am very jealous, but also delighted that you're getting some R&R out there, and it looks absolutely beautiful. Someone else who has been traveling this week, however, is King Charles. King Charles has been to the US. He's been over on a state visit to the US. And we thought, even though Jackie is all the way over there on the other side of the world, we thought we would get right into this. We'd get stuck in because without wanting to go too big too soon, it's gone down rather well. I'm not going to say any more than that. Jackie, what have been your thoughts? What are your takeaways from King Charles's state visit and the couple of speeches, the two or three appearances he's made, because they have been really, really interesting from a comms perspective and from a royal family perspective as well, haven't they?
100%. It's really interesting to me that just recently the media has been pretty negative about everything royal. And also, we're living in very troubled times. And for the first time in such a significant time, we're starting to see reportage of good news. And I have to say, I've taken my hat off, I'm now wearing a scarf, take my hat off to King Charles's communications team, speech writers. I know they said that he had taken a very, very strong hand in the writing of both speeches he delivered. But the language, the wit, the balance, the objective meeting, all of the components of that speech or those speeches were superb and has actually led, I think, to a bit of what we need in the press at the moment, some good news and some feel good about our own country. I think people are now actually seeing the real power of the monarchy, the real impact and the real influence for good that the royals can have. And it couldn't have happened for me at a better time because of what Harry and Meghan have been playing at doing with this quasi-royal tour. In sweeps King Charles and Queen Camilla. And you can't discount, we're all talking about King Charles, but Queen Camilla has absolutely knocked it out of the park as well. And the bonhomie between the two couples, Charles and Camilla, and President Trump and Melania, the whole picture, all of the optics, every single part of that visit has been planned down to the nth degree. People like me noticed things like the fact that Queen Camilla was wearing pink, a deep fuchsia pink, and Melania wore a rose pink. That they had clearly color coordinated their wardrobes. They've done this before as well. They have form about this. But even those small little visual optics that reassure and make you see that the two couples are in absolute harmony. They have worked on this as a trip together. They obviously have huge amounts of respect, not in terms of what they say, but in what they do, how they visually present themselves. And you contrast that with Harry and Meghan using photo opportunities to sell Meghan's wardrobe, and you just couldn't get further apart. The poles couldn't be further apart. So those were my first sort of initial views of the whole trip. But there's many more details to jump into.
Absolutely. I think the first thing I'd like to launch straight into is something I've taken is the atmosphere around this trip. And actually what's important then is also to provide a little bit of context. I've just been doing a really, really quick fact check. Straight off the bat, King Charles is still very, very poorly, still dealing with that illness that has been widely reported. 77 years old. King Charles is 77 years old. This is a long trip. This is a long journey, obviously traveling in extreme comfort and all these sorts of things. But 77 years old, so an elderly gentleman. That's the first thing. Context purely on who he is and where he is in his life. Then you bring the pressure in, the pressure of this. This is not just him going to the US because that's something they decided to do. Our Prime Minister here in the United Kingdom, Keir Starmer, this was incredibly important to him and the context around relations between the UK and the US at present, and Starmer and US President Donald Trump. Starmer's sent Charles to thaw relations for diplomatic reasons. There's a tremendous amount of pressure. The reason I say atmosphere, and that's been one of my big takeaways, is to your exact point, Jackie. The second they touch down, the respect, the pageantry, the organization, the level of comfort that he clearly has. He's so at ease, and they're both, I'm talking about Charles and Camilla actually here, both of them, they're so at ease with themselves. They're so clearly unbelievably well prepared that every single minute of this trip, they're not scrambling, they're not diverting, they're not changing strategy. Just how much is that a testament to the royal machine, the royal organization, the PR team, the comms team, the planning team, but also to Charles and Camilla themselves? And this is years and years and years of them, I'm going to say something, honing their craft. I found bits of it almost theatrical. And obviously that's something I really do have a bit of a passion for. I found bits of it almost theatrical in its presentation, but in a really truthful way, not like la-di-da, this is who we are. It was so specific, it was so planned, just pristine in its execution, wasn't it?
Yeah, he and Camilla had very clear objectives when planning and going on this trip. The interesting thing to me was that in the run-up to all of this, the press was reporting things like, Charles has cancer. It's probably not the sort of thing he would want to do himself. It felt like it was demanded of him by the government. We even made comments about that ourselves. But that was the reportage. That was what was coming up in the press. But I genuinely think he enjoyed it. I think he seemed very comfortable. And I think it was not lost on me that Charles put a few things in his speech that mattered to him. There was clearly things in his speech. And this was the interesting thing about what he did. And it crossed a line. For the first time, he actually crossed a line and looked very comfortable with that. And where he crossed the line was he made quite a political speech. And Queen Elizabeth II would never have done that. She wouldn't have even touched on any of her own interests or any political causes or anything like that. But he's taken it a step further. He's decided that he wanted to talk about the world and how nature is being impacted by the rising climate and all of the sort of non-sustainable, let's say, activities that a lot of the bigger powers like the USA are taking, and, trying to appeal to all of the world really using his platform. That was taken. And then he went into talking about NATO and did a very solid defense of NATO. And then he made a distinct appeal to help Ukraine. Now, these were all things which I felt were very significant. But the other thing that I couldn't help but draw a conclusion from was that we criticized Prince Harry for going to Ukraine and criticizing Trump for his defense of Ukraine, or tasking him to come to give more help to Ukraine. And at the time, this was seen as something that was a little bit above Harry's station, let's say. But now Dad is doing exactly the same thing. And this brings me back to these soft messages that we get through any speech. And I felt that that was a soft message to say, I'm in support of what Prince Harry said, which I think is quite telling. And it plays into what Richard Eden at Daily Mail has been saying about Project Thor, because the king could have decided not to go down that route at all. And if he hadn't gone down that route, the natural conclusions would be, look at the king. He doesn't talk about Ukraine. Harry definitely spoke out of turn. But they seem to be in cahoots over that. So that to me is quite significant.
Hold it right there, listeners. We just wanted to take this opportunity to say that we absolutely love recording this content for you. So please do like, subscribe, follow us wherever it is that you get your podcasts. It does make a difference, and it really does mean the world to us as well. And please do head to our Substack as well. Search Where Pop Culture Meets PR on that platform. Subscribe. It's free, and we've got lots of great content going up on there as well. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of this episode. And actually, there are any number of like real life analogies you could use. The one that springs to mind is, and this might sound a bit provocative, but forgive me and go with me. Son comes back from school. I want to say X, Y, and Z about something that happened on the playground. And dad turns around and goes, well, why say it here away from the playground? I'm going to go to the playground and say exactly. Do you see what I mean? Like where I'm getting at is the directness with which Charles has gone. Because I agree with you. I think there is definitely something in that, this idea of Project Thor.
There is.
I'm leaning into it, but he's gone there. And obviously I know contextually and the situation surrounding it, you know, the Harry and Meghan situation and Trump having said what he said about Harry and Meghan, and maybe there isn't really a feel that he could go and say these things there in front of Charles, and Trump have a different relationship. But I found his directness with, I mean, you mentioned crossing a line there, and quite often people use crossing a line as like sort of, you know, derogatory, like negative term. I think there's a lot of positives to take out of him having crossed this line. And he did it, in my opinion, more than once. Obviously that political speech, but also he was quite direct with Trump, wasn't he? There was a bit of a jocular vibe at times as well. I mean, I think the big viral thing, the thing that has gone viral, is his whole German French quip about the fact that Trump often says, without US involvement in the 1940s, the Brits would be speaking German. Dare I say, if we hadn't got involved 250 years ago, you'd all be speaking you'll be speaking French. Now, this is something that I don't think Trump in an ordinary setting would like. But Charles not only feels comfortable in being that direct, but it was clearly planned. This was clearly planned. I mean, what can we say about that in terms of the fact that, again, just that comfort, that level of directness?
They've got the measure of each other. I think that some commentators are saying Charles could say anything and probably say the orange man to Trump's face, and still Trump wouldn't get upset with him. I don't actually subscribe to that. But jocularity, the jocular, I love that jocular word because that was actually what it was. And I think that they share a wry sense of humor, a little bit of banter, because from what I've observed from Trump, I think on Pod Round, I was looking at one of Robert Hardman having met Trump, and Trump likes to have a little bit of a nudge, a back and forth. And this seems to be reflected in his relationship with Charles. So I think Charles has got the measure of the man. And I think he knew how far he could go. And also with the extremely long speech, you need some elements of humor. You need some rises and falls. You need some light and shade. And his speechwriter and his speech writing himself was absolutely superb. So I think if you build it into a speech that way, and this is why the Palace does this so well. This is what we talk about when we talk about well-planned communications. Everything about both speeches, both in that reception and to Congress, they all had a point to make and they all had a message. They both had a deliver. And this is why the Palace are experts at this. And this is where you kind of like, I come back to the quasi-royal tour of Meghan and Harry. The timing of this couldn't be better to show this is what a royal tour is all about. This is how it's done. This is how it's reported. And this is why we do it.
You're absolutely spot on. And actually, when it comes to, I mean, we've spoken a bit about the speeches, and I think it's important to do so because, to your point, the way they were structured, I think I mentioned earlier, you can tell that he's always had a passion for, you know, theatre and public speaking and performance. That's always something that he, you know, it's been widely reported he's been quite passionate about. You know, small tangent, I think one of my favourite clips ever is him getting involved in that To Be or Not To Be Hamlet off and coming in, and I'm not sure if you've seen it. If you haven't, it's absolutely brilliant. Do please look it up. But, you know, the speeches are well worth bringing in. But the whole trip, you know, the comfort, the respect, both he was shown, but I think important, they showed the American public, the American people, Trump, Melania. I'm also going to bring something in here. This is something that, you know, really struck me, I think, before they went. And actually, since then, I think it's just been an incredibly clever thing. The comms team were very, very clear in their brief that should protests happen, they were ready. They were ready. They were prepared for there to be protests when it came to, various things that have happened with the royal family back over here and UK-US relations and what have you. They were prepared for it, but everything was being done to avoid that level of like sort of public exposure. There was like a planned block party appearance, but other than that, it was very diplomatic. It was very high level. It was speeches. It was meeting with Trump. It was charitable excursions, etc. I don't think there were then many. I might be wrong, but I've not seen that many reported.
I didn't see any reported, but then again, I'm on holiday at the moment, so I've not been studying the press as hard as I should be, really.
But from a comms perspective, how good are the royal machine at managing expectations in that regard relative to quasi-royal tours that we've mentioned before and other trips of its kind? Because actually, I think my psyche then went, there are going to be some. And then when I don't hear about any or too much or what have you, I go, that's just another thing that makes me feel that this trip has had huge success and the optics of it are really, really good. How good are they at managing those expectations ahead of these trips? Because it struck me as a comms masterclass ahead of time.
I think the planning of the visits after all of the official state reception. So we're looking at, for example, their visit to the site of the Twin Towers, which means an enormous amount to the people of New York. And I think something we were discussing actually, Lyle, just before we came on air with producer Felix, was the fact that, and Felix made this point, that he united in his speech both sides of the House. And we were talking about, it was the first time really a non-partisan speech was delivered. And that's why he got numerous ovations. I think there was 12 standing ovations, maybe more, cheers and, commentary like, about how great it was to hear a great speech in the House. And I think America as a continent is very divided at the moment, very split. You're either red or blue. There's nothing in between. And I think for the first time, they experienced on a political level somebody speaking just simply from a non-partisan perspective. And that was a great thing to experience for them. And also to people come and show respect to some of their, most important memorials as well. And I think Americans do like that feeling of history and where they come from. And there was an interesting line in, I think it was Donald Trump's speech when he was talking about Anglo-Saxon blood running through the veins. I think there's a kind of a misconception of how many different nationalities make up the now American population. It was very uniting. And I think you have to give a huge pat on the back to the communications team for putting Charles and Camilla in the right place with the right tools around them on all the organization, everywhere they went, planned to the absolute millisecond, down to what they wore, where they were going to be pictured, what they were going to do, who they were going to speak to, what was going to be public, what was going to be private, all of that meticulously planned down to the nth degree. And even somebody crashing into the president's dinner with the journalists and another assassination attempt, even that just got wiped off the front pages, because I think the way it was done was really welcomed. And even Prince Harry, who has agitated Trump so much to the point that he gets asked a question in the Oval Office a week before the royal visit. And he says, send my regards to his wife, and very pointed and saying that he felt he spoke for the UK more than Harry did. Very pointed. Even Prince Harry and Meghan couldn't annoy Trump to the extent that he wasn't welcoming and genial to Charles and Camilla. But he did say, apparently, Trump did say to one of the British visitors, "Can you take him back, please?" That was reported by Richard Eden from the Daily Mail.
Oh my goodness. So you see, even then, and actually this actually leads really nicely into another question I have, because even then he just couldn't help himself, could he? And actually another thing, and I feel like listeners and viewers, I hope you don't mind, Jackie and I just really do. We are sending this up a bit because I've been very, very impressed. I know Jackie has. I'm very, very impressed with how it's been planned, how it's been structured. I think one of the other reasons I'm so impressed is just the unpredictability of the persons that he was going to visit. And actually, that's a really lovely point that you make that segues quite nicely into it. Even then, he just couldn't help himself, couldn't help a little quip here, a little quip there. It's almost as if Charles and the level of preparation that the royal family and Charles and Camilla have gone into, and the royal team, like, it's like fire and ice, isn't it? It meshes quite nicely with the unpredictability of Trump and his comms team, and the fact that they have to almost prepare for lack of preparation. The fact that Trump can just throw a quip out here and throw a quip out there, it's really
Well, there is
interesting, isn't it, the
something
dynamic.
predictable about his unpredictability, if that
Yes.
makes sense. If there's ones that you cannot control. And I think in a really weird way, it's a good thing for all of us to think about, because something that we always say in PR is that you cannot control the narrative. It is not possible to control the narrative. And dealing with Trump is the greatest example of not being able to control a narrative. So you resort back to what we talk about a lot, and that is message making and message delivery, and knowing what your vision, your mission, and your values are. And if there was ever a greater example of that came from King Charles, and his message delivery was perfect. And it doesn't matter. He wasn't trying to control a narrative. This is what we talk about. King Charles is probably the best example of a spokesperson for a country that you'll ever get. And while our producer Felix doesn't think that it was the best of speeches in the world, I think through pure message delivery, it was. And I think it was one of the most significant speeches of our time in the context of all of the conflict that is happening all over the world, that ends up landing at the doors of the White House. And that's important. And that's where it gets really serious. And again, this is the grown-ups communication skills. This is the way the grown-ups talk to each other and message each other and make things happen. Let's contrast that with Harry and Meghan. And honestly, I've never seen such petulance, and two middle-aged people, let's face it, these two are in their 40s, and they still manage to behave like spoilt children, brats, throwing their toys out of their prams with the People magazine cover that they decided to engineer in the wake of Charles's brilliance. They decide they're going to throw a bit of shade by appearing on the front cover of People magazine with the headline making their own rules. It was just tawdry, I think is the best word I can use. It was cheap, it was tawdry, it was low class. It was the opposite of anything that was on display from Charles and Camilla. Harry and Meghan, in my view, had sunk as low as they could go with selling her clothes off the back of their work with charity. But this was a new low. This was a lower than low activity. And I can't express how revolting I think it was.
Before we go any further, we would just like to tell you about a new podcast from the creative minds behind Where Pop Culture Meets PR. By fans and for fans, Pod Round discovers and curates the best episodes from across YouTube, Spotify, Substack, the whole pod landscape, and delivers the ones worth your time straight to you, serving up different genres, different voices from all corners of the globe. Pod Round is the one-stop shop for podcast lovers. That's Pod Round. Available wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much and enjoy the rest of this episode. But you've done a pretty good job there, to be fair. You have done a pretty decent job there. Again, a really interesting point as well as we continue this is I found myself thinking about fundamental issues of importance and what people believe to be important when it comes to their own pursuits and their own trips. And I'll explain what I mean by this. As I mentioned earlier, Charles is 77 years old, which means that it is a fact, whether he was aware of it or not, that he has been a royal for 77 years, and therefore a working royal I can be corrected if I'm wrong here, for the thin end of 60 years, because obviously when you assume being an adult in the royal family, you are then off doing various things. And yet it has been commented by people just like members of the court of public opinion, but also by various commentators, that this is the most important trip of his royal career, not just of his career as reign as king, his reign as monarch here in the United Kingdom, but the most important thing he has ever had to do as a royal. You compare that to what Harry and Meghan seemingly believed was important on their trip. But I'm really struck by something you said right at the top of this episode. This trip's been a reminder, I think, hasn't it? This trip has been a reminder of just how important they can be when things like this are got right, when the pressure is on, when it is important that it's got right. They come through, don't they? Charles and Camilla and the royal team come through in a way that, if they are to re-ingratiate themselves back into royal working life, if that is indeed the plan, certainly from Harry's perspective, they're going to need to learn quite quickly, aren't they? Because every single part of these trips is important. Not just the things that are planned and that you can see, but every single part, the atmosphere, the mutual respect, the way you conduct yourself. From the second you touch down, you can't be selling clothes. You can't be doing your own things. You see what I mean? And I was really struck by the word reminder, that actually Charles and Camilla have reminded us not just how it should be done, how important these things are, haven't they?
Yes, and to me, it's a shame that instead of taking in People magazine, in the articles that are written within People magazine, by the way, that People magazine, I know because I've media trained their journalists, that they don't do anything on speculation. They do things on verified sources, and they're very careful. They very, very, very rarely get tripped up. So we know that this is the mouthpiece of the Montecito Markles. And in there, they say they're taking baby steps towards a reconciliation. They say that Charles and Harry are speaking more regularly now. And this are the example of trying to control the narrative. They are petulantly and will continue, I predict, to do their quasi-royal tours. But I also predict that something like this, that Charles has done the masterclass, King Charles, Queen Camilla have shown people what real royal tours are all about. I think that in future, when Meghan and Harry are trying to do these quasi-royal tours, I don't think that they're going to get as enthusiastic a reception from those different places where they may want to visit, because it's also quickly and highlighted and contrasted. And let's also put a little nod into Princess Catherine and Prince William, who at the same time I felt came with a rearguard action behind the success of Queen Camilla and King Charles, with their best ever picture of them as a family celebrating their 15th wedding anniversary. And I just felt that it came at a time of great positivity around the monarchy that's been generated by Charles, and then followed up very nicely with this beautiful picture. And there wasn't much more than that, just saying they're celebrating. There wasn't any articles, or some commentators said that they might be trying to get a bit of, a bit of the light, the sunshine lit upon them. But I don't think so. I think this was very obviously planned. The palace King Charles's communications team will have known that it was their 15th wedding anniversary. I think there would have been communication between the two camps. And I think it was an elegant way of showing all of us why the royal family are beloved and why they matter. So it's so interesting to see the three different types of communications so markedly highlighted and so obvious in their objectives. And yeah, it's just been a very interesting time for observe and analyse the royal communications.
Extremely interesting. And I'm sure we can all agree, from a coverage of scandal and saga perspective, just extremely grateful that there was seemingly not a Photoshop in sight when it came to William and Catherine's photo, because the last thing we want is to go down that route again and, crisis comms and all that sort of thing. As we do bring this one to a close, I do have one final question. We've obviously done, we've analysed, and we've both been very impressed by the Charles and Camilla trip. Bit of a loaded question. but I'm really keen to get your take on this. You mentioned just now that should Harry and Meghan embark on a trip like this, obviously they live in America, but should they embark on doing something like this, the reaction and the response, they needs must anticipate a slightly frostier response when they visit certain territories and go on certain trips. We have obviously sent up, quite rightly, the Charles and Camilla trip, but is it in any way, and I'm not necessarily saying I agree with this, so I'm already backtracking, but is it in any way easier, in inverted commas, for our listeners to plan trips like this when you know there is an element of goodwill on the other side? Obviously, you do have to plan for the unpredictability. You do have to plan meticulously when it comes to the appearances, when it comes to the speeches. But Donald Trump has been very, very clear in his assertions that he has a lot of respect for Charles, has a lot of respect for Camilla. So were they already 1-0 up, to use a football analogy, ahead of their trip? Or am I just bringing something in there that does it down and diminishes the planning? Did you sort of see where I'm coming from when it comes to that question?
No, I don't think they were. I
No.
really don't. I think it's very obvious that Trump respects and reveres the institution of monarchy, but it could have gone any number of ways. Because Trump is so mercurial and so unpredictable. As I said, you can plan for unpredictability. So I genuinely believe that this could have gone wrong, with bad planning, with ill-judged visits to the wrong kind of places, to the temper of the speeches. No, I don't think it was a home run at all. And I think it could have swung another way if Charles had gone very deep into the NATO and the Ukraine issues. It was light touch, the way that was approached. So no, I give all kudos to the way everything was organized and delivered.
Yeah. And like I say, I'm absolutely inclined to agree with you for sure. And I've been very, very impressed with the execution. And we have, of course, seen as well, by no means a royal family visit and a royal trip, but we've, of course, seen in the past elements of surprise and unpredictability when it comes to meetings in the Oval Office, and we won't go too deep down that rabbit hole. So yeah, I just thought it was one of those interesting comparisons, because obviously Harry and Meghan, when they do attend these things, they do have to prepare for like a different atmosphere, and it's like.
But let me say one thing. Let me say one thing which I think is really, really important from a comms perspective. What people often do, what any company or individual often does, is have a great success and just expect to dine out on that success. And I want to reference one of the lady podcasters who I absolutely respect. And she touched on this in her Substack, Shauna Kay from Vintage Read podcast. I read an article from her that she'd written on her Substack, and she said she was proud of what King Charles had done, and really, applauded him for his strength in this case, but wanted now to see more of this Charles from him. And if I was on King Charles's communications team, and I think Tobin Andrew does an amazing job there, I would be thinking about the long term and the big picture objectives. And if he does want to start to help William in his objectives when he ascends to the throne, then this could be a really good springboard for Charles and his communications, because he's now put himself in a position of strength and respect. Now, we see Charles on a world stage with the leader of the free world loving him, respecting him, honouring him. This is now, he's in the ascent. His popularity will be going up in the polls. Queen Camilla's popularity will be going up in the polls. This is his time to think about continuing in this way of strength, diplomacy, but in his, I would say, very pointed objectives. You could see them coming out in how he spoke. This is now the time for him to land what he wants. Now, Shauna Kay hopes that he wants to put Harry and Meghan in their boxes and pave the way for William. I don't know what he wants, but I'd like him to make some more decisions about what he wants and communicate that. And this is the springboard that he can use.
I think springboard's a great word, and actually him being sort of back almost on, the sort of front line right there, front and center, and sort of, drawing attention there, I think is absolutely, you're right. It could well be a springboard. What do you think, our brilliant listeners and viewers? What have you made of this trip? What are your takeaways? We've obviously gone through our analysis and given you our thoughts, but we always absolutely love hearing yours as well. How do you think they got on? What did you make of the importance that this was being given in the build up to the trip? We would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get those comments in wherever you get your podcasts, particularly on our Substack. Search Where Pop Culture Meets PR. Subscribe, get those comments in. We love reading those. Thank you so much for joining us on this, the latest episode of our wonderful pod, Where Pop Culture Meets PR. From Jackie in sunnier climes, and from myself over here, and the weather's pretty good here as well, not to be fair. Take care of yourselves.
Good.
It's bye for now.